Thank you all for coming tonight. I want to tell you the story of a house. It's an old adobe built sometime in the 1880s or 90s in one of Tucson's oldest districts, Barrio Libre. It's a house that occupied me for the better part of 4 years, and it's a house that taught me what I now know about home. But before I can tell you the story of this house, there are some things that you need to know about me. The first is that I have always loved and longed for houses ever since I was a kid, when I would sketch out floor plans on sheets of loose leaf paper. And my mother too loved and longed for houses, but she was a single mom, struggling to take care of my baby sister and me. And so instead we had a mobile home, a trailer. And the house that my mother dreamed of was something that she never got. The next thing that you need to know about me is that I had a house of sorts. It was built by my great-grandfather in 1901 in Green Bay, Wisconsin, my hometown. My grandparents bought it shortly after their marriage in 1919, and then they proceeded to live there with their 3 kids for their entire lives. My dad left for the short time that he was married to my mom, and then he moved right back. And even though it was a real house, unlike the trailer that I lived in with my mom, at its center was something dark, fear and paranoia, mostly my grandmother's. She's the reason that they stayed when everyone else left for the suburbs, as the neighborhood started to fall apart around them, as the house started to fall apart. And shortly before we moved to Tucson, the last of them, my aunt, passed away. She had been born in the house, and she died there 82 years later, never having left, never having married, never having had kids. I was the only kid on that side of the family, and so I inherited the house, along with the life savings of 2 generations of blue-collar workers. Now, I had never lived in the house, but it was still the closest thing that I had to a family home, and I had fantasized about maybe being able to keep it and fix it, but that just wasn't realistic, and so I had to give it up. And then finally, the last thing that you need to know about me is that when I was 15 years old, 2 men came into the tavern where my mother tended bar, and they strangled her to death. Her murder was and will always be the worst thing that's ever happened to me. It was my first loss of home. And I've totally lost my place. It was my first loss of home. Anyway, we moved to Tucson. It was something I was still carrying with me 30 years later. When we moved to Tucson, we got here and we bought a house. It was a very nice house in Midtown Tucson. 2-car garage, swimming pool, and we felt really fortunate to have it. But at the same time, it just didn't feel right. It felt liminal somehow, almost like an apartment, like some place that we were just passing through. And I had been intrigued by a listing for an old adobe in Barrio Libre, but we had looked to see where it was on the map and saw that it was right next to the I-10, and we went, who'd want to live down there, right? Right next to the freeway. What we didn't understand at the time, of course, was that one of the reasons that the freeway had been put there was that civic leaders back in the 1960s had been trying to kill the mostly Mexican downtown barrios. But they didn't kill them, or at least not entirely, because the first thing that I noticed when I went down to the barrio shortly after we arrived in Tucson was how alive the neighborhood felt. There were murals on the sides of houses, and funky collections of potted plants on people's porches, and mobiles of shells and tiny mirrors and things that you could see over the tops of fences. Signs everywhere of how much people cherished their homes, and of how important beauty was in those homes. And so pretty soon I found myself driving past the barrio whenever I happened to be nearby. And then soon enough, I was driving past this old adobe on Convent Avenue in particular. It had been on the market 9 years, although it had been abandoned for decades before that, and it was a giant hulking ruin. When we first looked at it, its walls were crumbling. It had this roof of corrugated metal that looked like it might be held on by chewing gum. There was no working electricity. There was one ramshackle bathroom that was fed by a solar heater in the backyard. There were pigeons on the inside. There was graffiti on the inside. But still, there was beauty despite, or maybe because, of the ruin. So there were these 100-year-old wooden lintels and old adobe fireplaces and thick walls of mud bricks. But even more than that, it was the feel of the place. And the people who built what would become our house weren't architects, obviously. They were poor people, mostly untrained, but they still knew how to take the dirt beneath their feet and turn it into something that was not only beautiful, but that encompassed and embraced, that had endured. And I stood in the house, and I knew that the thing we had been looking for was there. Even so, the idea that we would buy it and rehabilitate it was crazy. For one thing, at over 4,600 square feet, it was much too large for a family that consisted of 2 writers and their 3 cats. It was entirely possible, and likely, in fact, that we would end up spending more renovating it than we might ever be able to sell it for someday. And the only way that we'd be able to afford the mortgage afterwards was if we became landlords, if we turned one end into a rental unit. But the good, or maybe it's the bad thing about having inherited money, is that it allows you to do crazy things. And then, too, there were all of these signs. So there was this giant salt cedar tree in the backyard that at one point in its life had fallen over. Most of it was on the ground. It should have been dead, but it kept on growing. It kept on sending branches up to the sky. There was the fact that the house reminded me of the Lison house, the house that I had just lost in certain ways. And then there was this Sagittarius wall hanging in the kitchen. It's my astrological symbol. Now, I am not that into astrology, but my mother was. She loved to get me things with my sign on them. And I didn't even notice it on our first couple of visits to the house. And then the day that I did, all I could do was stare. It was almost like the house had my name on it. But most significant of all was the fact that the house appeared in my life as I was approaching my 44th birthday, the age my mother had been when she was killed. Up until that point, it felt sort of like we were growing old together. I could think of her when I passed certain ages, compare my life with hers. But I was about to live past her. Once I turned 44, I was going to have to go it alone. And so I thought, maybe if I could take this broken place, this house, and make it whole again, maybe I could make myself home. So we did the crazy thing. We bought the house, and I say I because my husband, as I like to say, is a lover, not a builder. I spent a year working with architects, the contractor. I learned about adobe. I learned how to plaster, how to make my own mud plasters. We got the building permits and the financing in place and passed the historical reviews. And then we spent another entire year of actual construction, really dirt-filled year. And the contractors did most of the heavy lifting, of course, including making thousands of mud adobe bricks that we then dried in the backyard. But there was one thing that I insisted on doing mostly myself, and that was the walls. The walls were crumbling and damaged, and they had bits of old plaster sticking to them and layers of flaking paint, and they were streaked with time and rain and mud. And I knew that if I let them, the contractors would have plastered them over and made them look all perfect again. That was the last thing that I wanted. Instead, I wanted to keep them in their ruined state, at least as much as was practical. I wanted that story of the house's long years of neglect, its grief, if you will, to be something that you could read right there on the walls themselves. So December 11th, 2015 arrived, my 44th birthday. We had a huge housewarming party. People who worked on the house came, and people from the neighborhood came, and everyone else that we knew in Tucson came, and some people that we didn't know came. But it was great. It was a wonderful celebration, and a week later, we passed our final inspections, and we moved in, and there we were. We were home. And this is the part of the story where we're supposed to live happily ever after, and that is certainly what we thought would happen. We had said when we first bought the place that the only way we wanted to leave was feet first. But as it turned out, the story would have a different ending, one that, much to our surprise, featured a Hollywood movie star. Because our house, this house that I've been talking about, was recently purchased by Diane Keaton. We sold it to her this past spring. Now, that was a really difficult decision and one that we agonized over for many months. And it was this really long, drawn-out process that at times felt weirdly almost as if it were happening to us. Because even though we had been the ones to reach out, we kept asking ourselves, what on earth did we think we were doing? I mean, how could we ever sell this house, right? And there were practical reasons for selling. The house really was much too large. It demanded tremendous amounts of time and energy even after we moved in, and we kept having to pour money into it, all of which weighed heavily, especially on me. But the real reason, and I realized this only after we had actually packed up our things and left, was different. I had put my mother into the house and the Lison house into the house. What I had done, really, was to fashion a house out of grief and loss and memory. And I had to let it go. I realized that I had done all of that and gone through of all of that in order to let it go. And that I could let it go. That's what the house had been there to show me, that I didn't need it. That home was something I had never really lost. And that it was okay, this time, to say goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.